Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? In 1997, Apple built the world's fastest laptop. And shortly afterwards, they did it again. This is the original PowerBook G3, which Mac aficionados call Kanga after its development codename. It came hot on the heels of the impressive PowerBook 3400, with which it shares more than a striking resemblance. But we'll come back to that later. This particular machine isn't exactly in perfect shape. While it was said to work, it had a few cosmetic problems. The right clutch cover was loose, and that's because the plastic trim it clips to had cracked. The back side of the machine also showed another common problem. The display housing was separating, most likely due to a broken screw standoff. Finally, the pop-out feet weren't working properly. While they'd extend, they didn't want to retract without a struggle. Otherwise, the machine was an excellent candidate for restoration. It still had its original battery, but was missing any expansion bay modules. The rear I/O door was long gone, which is so common that now I'm actually surprised when they're still present. As such, I was happy to see the ADB port door, which also frequently goes missing. The keyboard was a little dirty and showed some serious wear on a few keys, but seemed easy enough to clean. Thankfully, I was able to pick up a PowerBook 3400 to use as a parts machine. It was in pretty rough shape, seemingly having been stored in a shed or garage for quite some time. Its keyboard was absolutely filthy, and while it didn't have as much wear as on the G3, I decided not to swap it over as it had become noticeably yellowed. The trackpad button was broken, another common problem with this model, but there was one big issue that likely sent this machine to the scrap pile. While it seemed to power on just fine, its 12-inch LCD was completely dead. But the display housing seemed intact, with no signs of broken standoffs, so I set out to swap over all the parts I needed to get the G3 looking good again. I started by taking apart the 3400. 3 Torx T8 screws hold in the keyboard. In fact, a T8 is the only screwdriver I'd need throughout the entire repair. From there, I could flip up the keyboard with the help of a spudger. Underneath, I found a RAM expansion module, which listed itself as being 24 megabytes. Along with the machine's 16 megabytes soldered to the motherboard, this would have brought the system to a total of 40 megs, a healthy amount for 1997. I unlatched the connectors for the keyboard so I could pull its ribbon cables free. This machine was just gross inside. Lots of hair, dirt, and even dead bugs. I took out the single screw holding in the speaker and button bar below the screen. On the backside resides the machine's rechargeable clock or PRAM battery, which has a simple 2-wire connection. I could then disconnect the button board's ribbon cable, followed by the display connector. At this point, the hinge covers were simply clipped to the case. It's a bit of a tight fit, and I worried about flexing the plastic too much, but they came out without issue. Then I could simply remove 2 screws holding the hinges to the bottom case and lift the display assembly free. And underneath it was the plastic trim piece I needed for the G3. I turned to that machine next. I suspect it had been resold at some point, as this warranty void sticker is not something Apple would have put on at the factory. The machine came apart in exactly the same way, and also had its own RAM upgrade card. The G3 Kanga had double the onboard RAM of the 3400, 32 megabytes, so this card brought the total to 64. Thankfully, this machine was far cleaner inside. Aside from some dust, which was to be expected, it was much less gross to disassemble. It's almost guaranteed that the PRAM batteries on both of these machines are dead, and experience has taught me that they're likely to start leaking. They're not really necessary for anything other than keeping the clock accurate, which I don't care about anyway, so I decided to remove them, like I do with all my retro computers. The only difference I noticed in the G3's enclosure is the addition of these metal brackets that reinforce the screen hinges. I wasn't aware of any known problems with the 3400's hinge design, but I guess Apple's engineers thought differently. And here's why that right hinge cover was loose. The plastic trim had broken off on that end. The hinge cover clips into it, so no visible fasteners are needed. But since the one from the 3400 was in good shape, it was easy enough to transfer over. One problem down, 2 to go. Identifying what was wrong with the pop-out feet was easy. The springs shouldn't be like that. I removed each spring and took out the feet. There's a pocket in each that the springs tuck into. Then I got them reinstalled, making sure to orient them the right way. I suspect they had come loose previously and someone put them in backwards. But now, they work great. On to the last problem, the display housing. I needed to disassemble both of them so I could swap their outer plastics. The G3's rear housing had a few more scratches, though the latch on the 3400 screen was a little bent. The bottom housing screws are hidden under the name badges. I used the backside of a craft knife to carefully pry them up, though a very thin and wide metal spudger would be the better choice. The top 2 screws reside under the rubber screen bumpers, which I could pry out easily. I gently slid a spudger between the case halves to release the retaining clips, being very mindful not to flex them too much. Brittle plastic, after all, is why I was doing this work to begin with. But the display came apart with little drama. Here's what one of the lower screw standoffs is supposed to look like, and here's the same one on the G3's display. Usually the plastic simply crumbles. This is the first time I've seen one split in half like this. While I was going to swap the display housings anyway, I decided to try gluing this standoff back together as an experiment. The permanent fix is to 3D print a replacement, which I've done in previous PowerBook restorations. But I was curious if super glue meant for plastics would be good enough for a part that saw infrequent use. This also gives us an opportunity to check out one of the quirks of the 3400 and Kanga's design, the pair of so-called subwoofers on the back of the display. They're fairly small, and while there are grills on either side, the space in the housing they fire into isn't very big. Needless to say, they aren't terribly effective, though at least their presence allowed for the backlight inverter to be mounted in the middle, which in turn kept the display bezels thin. With the LCD panel swapped between them, I got the screens put back together. After letting the glue dry, I carefully tightened the screw in the 3400's display, and it seemed to be holding. The G3 overall was cleaner than the 3400, but still had some dirt and grime that needed to be addressed. The rubber feet on the bottom had also turned to goo over time, which I scraped out. Then I got the machine put back together. The G3 Kanga was launched in November of 1997. At the same time, the 3400 was discontinued. That machine had been available in 180, 200, and 240 MHz versions, all of which used the PowerPC 603E processor. But the Kanga came in only one configuration, with a 250 MHz G3. While that's only a small increase in clock speed, the G3 CPU overall offered dramatically better performance. Benchmarks at the time put the Kanga as being 65% faster than the 3400, and real-world tests were equally as impressive. I pulled out my own perfect condition 200 MHz PowerBook 3400 to run a test well-suited for the late 90s. I used to use SoundJam MP for playing MP3 files and ripping them from CDs. That software, incidentally, was purchased by Apple in 2001 and turned into iTunes. MP3 conversion on this machine was not very fast back then. And just as I remember, ripping a CD track to a 256 kilobit per second MP3 file happens barely in real time. But by comparison, the Kanga gets the same task done about 70% faster, despite its clock speed increase of less than 25%. Competition with PC laptops in 1997 was heating up, and the 3400's early performance lead was eroding. Apple itself had been going through some very turbulent times. CEO Amelio was ousted in July of that year, and Steve Jobs hastily took over, which at the time was believed to be temporary. The company needed another win, and putting the new G3 processor in a PowerBook was an easy way to do it. But that upgrade had to happen in a hurry, and there wasn't time to design a whole new laptop. So they simply reworked the motherboard in the 3400 with the new processor and called it the PowerBook G3. It seems that even the name for the new computer came at the last minute because the batteries that shipped with it were labeled as being for the PowerBook 3500. The G3 came with a few other small upgrades. Besides the increase to its base RAM, it also stepped up from a 1.3, 2, or 3 GB hard drive to a 5 GB model. It also included a 20-speed modular CD-ROM drive, but since my machine was lacking one, I swapped over the 6-speed unit from the parts laptop. And aside from a faster graphics controller, that was it. G3 Kangas sold relatively well, at least as well as a high-performance laptop priced at $5,700 US would be expected to. The reason they're uncommon is because it was Apple's shortest-lived laptop model. They were discontinued in March of 1998, after only 5 months on the market, in favor of the all-new PowerBook G3 series. These were significantly different in their design and are commonly referred to now as the G3 Wall Street, after their internal codename. And while Wall Street showed a clear path forward for Apple and its design philosophy, Kanga marked an interesting turning point in the company's history. Born out of the mess of an executive shuffle, troubled finances, and desperate desire to remain relevant in an increasingly competitive market, the original PowerBook G3 managed to simply take a good product and make it even better. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on social media at thisdoesnotcomp, and as always, thanks for watching.